right, thank you so much for having me. So before I started my company, I was an international human rights lawyer, and I want to tell you kind of about one of the most seminal moments in my career when I was asked to write a code of laws for a refugee camp. But first, let's take a little bit of a step back. This is me in law school. As you can tell, I hated it, and I think this kind of embodies why. If you look, you'll see side eye, side eye, side eye. You know, basically, we're all judging each other. I'm judging the person taking the camera, taking the picture, which is probably my mom. You know, I don't know if you can tell, but I thought that law school was pretty much hell, you know? I felt totally ill-prepared for the academic environment, and I wasn't sure I would ever find my passion for the law. Luckily, I was wrong. So enter Professor David Barron. On the first day of our first class, he said something that really resonated with me. He said, the law is only as powerful in so much as people believe in it, right? And so that really stuck with me over time. I didn't know how important it would be. That idea that the law's power resided in those that governed it and those who enforced it. I experienced that for the first time when I went to Thailand. And I just want to clarify for you guys real quick. I'm not talking sort of about this Thailand. I'm talking about this Thailand. I was asked to serve as a rule of law fellow in the refugee camps bordering Thailand and Myanmar. And I just kind of want to set the context for you. I was working primarily in a camp called Mae La Oon camp. It was the biggest camp with 43,000 people. And by the time I got there, it was 25 years old. It was more of a city than it was a camp. And a little bit of information about the refugee crisis. Since 1948, and they declared independence from the British, there had been a civil war going on in Myanmar that only recently ended. At the time, it was the longest running conflict in the world. And so in 1984, refugees started coming over to Thailand, which created a protracted refugee crisis. You'll see here the definition from no man's land, and the refugee camps perfectly embodied that. We would get skirmishes on the border that spilled over from Myanmar. The Thai government didn't want to touch them. And so essentially, they operated in a legal vacuum. Officially, they were under Thai law, but in practice, the Thai authorities neither had the resources or at times the willingness to enforce the law. They were primarily interested in drug crimes, so things like assault and theft went unenforced. And we had to sort of come up with laws that represented the people of Myanmar, the refugees, which was hard because Myanmar sits at a crossroads in Asia. It's one of the most ethnically diverse countries on the planet. So, like any good NGO, we formed a committee. And on that committee, there were representatives from the different ethnic groups, religious groups, advocates for women and girls, civil society leaders, all sorts of people that we thought embodied those ideals. And we spent days, hours in grinding negotiations, hammering out the content and the format of the code. And when we weren't doing that, I was developing trainings to help camp security figure out how to implement it in a way that was in line with international law. We also did detention monitoring, which I would go to the camps where people had been taken out of the general population and make sure they were kept in conditions in line with international law. And I was only there for a year. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure if what I did was effective, but I learned a few key things. Number one, codifying morality is hard. Number two, the law is a fiction. Number three, the law can be a method of social control. And number four, knowledge of the law is power. So it turns out that Professor David Barron was right. The law is at best a tool, a subjective one at that, and it can be used and manipulated for any means. It doesn't derive its moral authority from anything related to the fact that it's a law. And this also sort of started my path into critical research, right? I started thinking about the human rights regime and the hierarchies that it enforced, like the fact I was a 27-year-old dictating laws. I started thinking about a system that preached rule of law and universal human rights while allowing countries not to honor their international obligations. And so now I think about where and for whom the law is a fiction. And for me, critically interrogating the law has helped me rediscover my passion. So I guess if there's one real takeaway from this, I would say that the law, social order is vital, but fragile, that we need to dig deep and critically interrogate it, that we shouldn't just take its power for granted, and that once things fall apart, it can be really hard to find our path forward. Thank you.
Give her the hat.